Ted?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I was wondering if I could ask a couple of questions of Jessica Peters in terms of your report. I want to focus on the stability of cap and trade revenue, and it's been brought up, but my fear and my concern is that just because there's revenue there now doesn't mean it's going to be there through 2050. And isn't the purpose of cap and trade to get emitters to change their ways? And if they do change their ways, then they're not going to be paying a tax for emitting. So can you address the question of the stability of cap and trade revenue for me?
Sure. I think we also have Ross Brown of our office, who is our cap and trade expert. So as he's coming up to the table, I think in the short term, we think the authority, they're assuming about $500 million coming in from cap and trade through their 25% appropriation. And in the short term, that appears to be a reasonable estimate. Mm-hmm. Over the longer term, there's many factors, including the price of allowances, number of allowances, and how successful other programs are at reducing greenhouse gas emissions that would all affect the amount of revenue. And so it's much harder to predict over the long term. But I'll let Ross speak to that a little bit more, Mr. Brown.
Great, that's great. And yeah, to this issue of static, static analysis versus dynamic. So when we take a look at the flow of revenue over the next 30 plus years, is the revenue going to be there?
Ross Brown with the LAO. Assuming, again, the continuation of the program over that time period, then as my colleague, Ms. Peters, mentioned, there's a lot of different factors. And I think sort of the two biggest factors to consider when you think about the overall pot of revenue that might be generated through the cap and trade program, it's one, the number of allowances that are auctioned off. And I think as you're referring to, that number of allowances, assuming the cap is declining, will likely decline over time as well. The other factor is the price and what the price of allowances will be over the long term, and how those two balance each other out is difficult to predict. There's a lot of uncertainty, and as Ms. Peters mentioned, a lot of those factors that contribute to that uncertainty are very, very difficult to predict. And that's just the overall pot of money. Then you get into the issue, again, of what portion of the overall amount of revenue generated from cap and trade will be going to high-speed rail, and that's a decision, of course, for the legislature to make.
Okay. Now, do you know to what degree emitters have been exiting the state of California, high emitters? I'm seeing a lot of evidence just when I talk to my colleagues in the state of Nevada, colleagues that are now in Texas, about how there's just out-migration of manufacturing capacity that emits certain pollutants. So can you touch on that a little bit in terms of what's happening within our economy?
Yeah, I think it's a question that I'm not aware of a lot of great information and sort of very rigorous studies on it right now, and so I can't really say exactly. I do know that the Air Resources Board has been working with some researchers to try and get a sense of this issue of leakage and the extent to which the program is encouraging businesses to move production out of state. And so I'd be happy to chat with them a little bit more to sort of get a better understanding of when the timelines of those studies are.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you. And back to Jessica, if I could, about this $40 billion gap. How is that filled?
So in the draft business plan, the authority does not identify a way to fully fill, I believe it's about a $44 billion gap. The plan does contemplate seeking federal funds for about $3 billion of that in order to extend the initial operating segment into Bakersfield as well as San Francisco. And that would leave, I think, the $40 billion gap that you're referring to. The authority's draft business plan contemplates securitizing operating profits once there is an operable portion of the system up and running. But based on first of all, it's not clear to us whether the system will generate a profit that could be securitized. But even if you assume that their estimates are correct and that it will generate a profit to the the magnitude that the authority identifies in its plan, that the amount of funding that they could securitize from that is still, only, around $7 billion. And so it falls significantly short of the amount that would be needed. I think the peer review group in their analysis goes a step further and says, okay, if you could somehow count securitizing the operating profits from the entire phase one system, that gets you even a little bit further, but that would still leave you with about a $20 billion gap. We didn't include the full phase one securitization because it's an issue of timing. You can't securitize the revenues from a system that hasn't been built yet. And so, in terms of trying to say, well, phase one would generate a certain amount of operating profit, and you could securitize that, well, you have to build it in the first place. And so.
Okay.
It's just very unclear, and we think that's one of the issues for the legislature to consider, and an issue for the authority, that they need a comprehensive and credible funding plan for all of phase one. And given the information you have right now, you have a much stronger funding plan for the initial operating segment. And because that would exhaust all of those identified funding sources, you're going to want to consider the scope of what is built in the initial operating segment, because that might be all that you get if additional funding is not identified.
Okay, and have you done any analysis on the prospects of profitability? I mean, is there a profit, in your perspective, in your opinion, is there a profit there to be securitized?
We have not done an analysis. I think it's very uncertain. The peer review group may have looked into a little bit more some of the issues, the technical issues of ridership and revenue. These things, even for an infrastructure asset that is familiar, like a toll lane or something like that, where people are used to driving and you're used to taking that particular highway, it can be very challenging to estimate the revenues from some sort of user pay facility. And so we don't have any specific concerns that we're raising with the specifics in their estimates, but it's just very uncertain at this stage.
Okay. That's great. Thank you. And I just want to remind everybody about, we're all familiar with Moore's Law and how computer power would double every 2 years. Well, there's also an Edwards Law, and my formal name is Edward. I don't claim it, but I am going to recite it because I think it's very interesting. And Edwards Law states that from start to finish, a government project will double in cost. And so if we take a look at the Bay Bridge, that started at about, I don't know what figure you want to use, $1 billion or $2 billion, but it ended up being, I think, over $6 billion. And I'm very concerned about the financial capacity of the state of California to actually execute on this project. And just having a fun time with numbers, I know this sounds ridiculous, but if we take a look at the Tesla Model 3, okay, in about 24 to 36 hours, they had 200,000 orders. If you took the $70 billion estimate, we could buy 2 million new Tesla Model 3s, and you could literally give those to individuals that needed transportation in some of the more rural parts of our state. And I think what's really interesting about this is if we look at technology, it's going to the self-driving car. And I think that technology is actually passing up what is proposed with high-speed rail, and that I'm not advocating that we spend our tax dollars that way, but I'm saying that I don't think we can get the project done. I think it's going to be tremendously over budget, and we're going to be looking at subsidizing this forever. And is that the right policy decision for the state of California as we move forward? So, thank you.